Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Latham and Watkins Forum at NYU Law School. It's great to see a full room. I'm Vanita Gupta. I'm a scholar in residence here at my alma mater. Very proud to be of this institution. I am really thrilled to be able to host this very important and timely conversation today, state AGs on justice, law, and policy in the Trump era. And it's with Colorado State AG Phil Weiser, New Jersey State AG Matthew Platkin, and New York First Deputy State AG Jen Levy. So while I'm not going to read bios today, and you should all be grateful for that, I do feel the need to point out that 3 out of 4 of us actually attended this institution.
Sorry.
Matt Platkin shouldn't be on stage because he went to school out west somewhere. But a big shout out to NYU Law School for that reason as well. In my prior roles at the U.S. Justice Department, first as head of Civil Rights Division from 2014 to 2017, and then as Associate Attorney General overseeing the civil litigating components at the Justice Department from 2021 to 2024, I worked very closely with and sometimes litigated very rigorously against state attorneys general. And I wanted to be able to bring this conversation to this room at this time for all of the reasons that you might expect. State attorneys general play a very crucial and important role in anchoring the rule of law. They've long played a critical role in shaping law and policy and pursuing justice in their jurisdictions. I also know that state AG offices actually don't look the same everywhere, and we'll talk about this a little bit. They have different authorities depending on state law. And while state AGs have independent concerns and priorities from the federal government and the federal government's prerogatives, their roles and focus are also necessarily, in some ways, shaped by what's happening in Washington, D.C. And there's a lot happening in Washington, D.C. at the moment with our institutions, with laws and policies that may have long been taken for granted with our federal workforce and the like. It is quite an unprecedented time, I can say, from having been doing this work for a few decades now. We're going to drill down into some key questions about how the state's top law enforcers actually go about their roles and how they're thinking about their roles in this new federal administration. I'm going to open up questions about 20 minutes from the end for folks to come up to the mics, if you will. So think now about your questions, and we'll transition to that. And as a side note, I just want to also acknowledge that these are 3 representatives. Jen Levy is a representative, 2 other state AGs who are democratically appointed or Democrats themselves. We did invite a Republican state AG who unfortunately was unable to attend. So I thought we should start with some level setting, actually, in part because offices look different, your roles are different. If you could, kind of in 2 minutes or less, each of you describe your offices, were you elected, were you appointed, and what your authorities are, and how you thought about your priorities prior to the change in administration. And Phil, if I could start with you.
Thank you. I was where you guys all were in the early 1990s, and I never would have imagined where my path would take me. I would strongly encourage all of you to think about getting outside of New York and getting outside of the comfort zone of large law firms here, which I know is a very easy, comforting to do. I went to clerk in Denver, Colorado, because a mentor here said to me that was the best job that one could get when they graduate, and I am forever in his debt. It was an incredible experience. Fell in love with Colorado. I clerked again in Washington, worked for the Department of Justice, and then joined the faculty at the University of Colorado Law School. Worked for President Obama again in the Justice Department, and I would have gone to a Hillary Clinton Justice Department too, had there been one. But there wasn't. So I ran to be Colorado Attorney General in 2018, and I'm now in my 2nd term, haven't been reelected. My focus has been on consumer protection and antitrust. I hope we could talk a little bit about that. Protecting our land, air, and water, something that is deeply important in Colorado. defending civil rights, improving public safety, addressing the opioid crisis, and most recently addressing the youth mental health crisis. We have an office of 750 people, divided into a number of sections. We represent Colorado State government on every legal issue you can imagine. We have limited criminal authority, unlike my good friend and colleague from New Jersey, which has a lot more authority in the criminal area. We do take on some organized crime that's multi-jurisdictional, financial white-collar crime, environmental crimes, Medicaid fraud. Most of our criminal work is actually appellate work. We handle most of the appeals in our state. Consumer protection, as I mentioned, is an area of my background, a huge priority. And then every other issue under the sun that comes up for Colorado State government, from public health to water law to overseeing oil and gas development. So it's an incredible job. If you believe in public service, if you care about using the law for good, I honestly can tell you working the State Attorney General's office is the best job. I hope you all think about that, and I know we'll talk about that.
Great. Jen.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Levy, and I also sat where you are sitting in the early 90s. I don't remember Phil, though. Are you sure you were here?
What year did you graduate?
95.
I was 94. You're my brother's class. Bob Ferguson, by the way, former Washington Attorney General, was 95. And Bob and I played basketball together. So who knows who you're playing basketball with?
And I'm here to tell you that New York City is the best place in the world, and you should never leave it. And our offices are a mere 2 stops away. And we have a lot of alums in our executive chamber. The New York State Attorney General is also an elected position. This is her second term as well, independently elected from the other statewide electeds, the governor and the comptroller. We have 1,700 employees, about 700 or more than 700 of whom are attorneys in 25 locations across the state. Our bread and butter is to represent the state in defensive actions and state agencies. We also have limited original criminal jurisdiction that's very similar to the Colorado Attorney General's office with multi-jurisdictional crimes, wage theft and deed theft, notably. And we also notably have 2 affirmative divisions, the economic justice and social justice divisions. And the priorities of that work are consumer, which has historically been the role of the Attorney General, particularly in New York, health, abating the opioids epidemic has been a big part of this Attorney General's focus, deed theft, antitrust, and big tech, largely led by Attorney General Weiser, and in civil rights, police accountability.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to thank Vanita for organizing this, and for all the students, whatever you take away from today, I hope you take away, I didn't go here, so I got it, that's already been, I've been outed, but you're incredibly lucky to have people like Vanita here who are incredible public servants, and wherever, I can say this, wherever you are, if you're ever in the presence of people who have stood up for the rule of law and have fought for what this country stands for, people like Vanita, take the time to get to know them if she will, because she's somebody who I've looked up to as well. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm proud to talk about the work that we're doing with 2 people who I now talk to more than my wife, so I know them very well. We're not going to talk about the Nuggets record against the Knicks this year. That's off the table. But I'm an appointed Attorney General, which is why I can say whatever I want. So New Jersey, the Attorney General is appointed by the governor, and once confirmed by the Senate, which I was, with bipartisan support, I'm proud of, you can't be fired. So you have very strong protections. You have a term that's consistent with the governor. So my term runs for another year until January of 2026. I have, as Attorney General Weiser noted, we have very broad authority in New Jersey. They like 1947, we got a new constitution. They really like strong executives in New Jersey. So we have the strongest governor constitutionally in the country. We have the strongest chief justice, and we have a very strong attorney general. We have about 8,000 employees in our department. It's a little inflated because about half of that, a little less than half of that is state police, which is under my jurisdiction. We have complete criminal jurisdiction, so there's no elected prosecutors in New Jersey. We don't have DAs, they're called county prosecutors. We have 21 county prosecutors. They all report up to our office. We can take any criminal case We also have what's called directive authority, which means we can write rules that carry the force of law for all law enforcement, so 42,000 law enforcement officers throughout the state. We have a state criminal prosecution agency. It's about 500 or so lawyers and investigators, principally focused and was created to tackle big corruption cases, organized crime, RICO. We've invested heavily in human trafficking, which is something that I've been very invested in. And so we do a lot of criminal work. We also, like my colleagues, have broad civil authority. So we're the counsel to all of our state agencies. In fact, legally, we are the only lawyers that are allowed to represent the state in court, whether that be defensively or affirmatively, on behalf of the state. We have independent authority to bring civil rights cases, consumer cases, and a whole bunch of other areas, which I'm sure we'll talk about. We have a bunch of random areas that we regulate. So we regulate alcohol, gambling, boxing, MMA. Dana White should pay attention to that. But I just co-sign everything that's been said. It's an amazing job. It is an amazing place to work. The flexibility we have to take on issues that matter. And the thing I would underscore, which I know we're going to get into, my priorities didn't change on November 5th. My priorities are to protect the residents of our state, whether that be public safety, which I'm proud of the fact that 2 years running we've had record low levels of gun violence, taking on with Phil and Jen, social media companies that have hurt our kids, tackling the opioid epidemic, protecting our environment, or protecting our residents from clear harms imposed by a federal administration. That prism that I view everything through didn't change. I think some of the work has changed, but the priorities didn't change, and I'm happy to get into that.
So you kind of teed up where, the next question, which is kind of given the moment that we're in with the new administration that's very quickly made its kind of policy prerogatives and, prerogatives around the federal government, the role of the federal government incredibly clear. So you said your priorities haven't changed. Maybe you could start and then we'll go down the line about how you view your role as having shifted vis-a-vis the federal government and your role in kind of how your priorities may not have changed, but the kind of approach you might be taking in this moment.
Look, like I said, my job, and I think all of us who serve as attorneys general, I serve 9.5 million people. I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution of this country, the Constitution of our state, and to protect them. And I think we've done that as attorneys general and certainly in the 3 years that I've been in the office. I think it's fair to say the harms threatened to our residents, certainly since January 20th, have increased when you look at what the federal government has done. And the two cases that we filed right off the bat, first on the second day of the administration, the first full day of the administration, challenging really an incredible executive order, an unprecedented executive order, attempting to rewrite the 14th Amendment of the Constitution for the first time in 157 years to eliminate birthright citizenship, something that was put in the Constitution after the Civil War to end the brief period after the Dred Scott decision where there was any debate about whether if you were born on U.S. soil, you were subject to the rights and privileges of this country. And yet, with a stroke of a pen at 8 p.m. or 8:30 p.m. on Monday, January 20th, the president attempted to rewrite that for a whole class residents, harming people in our state, and I think undermining what people thought generally were well-accepted norms here. Similarly, last week, when we all joined and New York led the challenge to the insane OMB directive that froze trillions of dollars of federal spending because the president doesn't like some woke policy of the moment. That's not what the law allows. And you got to think about what the harms are to our residents. Okay? For a day, froze Medicaid, something that 75 million Americans rely on for health care. If you have a parent in a nursing home, odds are it's paid by Medicaid. Middle of winter, threatening to throw them out in the street. If you have a kid in Head Start, ended Head Start. I got a notice, this is 100% true, that they were ending HIDTA, which is the drug cartel trafficking enforcement program that we participate in. I thought that was a priority for this administration. So you think about harms to residents, unlawful acts that hurt our residents. That was like a textbook example of what the president cannot do and why we have legal and constitutional limitations on a president's authority. When Congress appropriates money, a president signs that law appropriating that spending, the president can't wake up and punish places because he doesn't like certain things. There's a way to address policy disagreements. Punishing seniors' health care, kids' education, and public safety is not a legal way to do it. And so I think it's fair to say we've had to stand up. Those are not threats that we had in the last administration that we do now. But the best thing I can say is the three of us and our offices and our colleagues, we were ready. We filed both of those lawsuits less than 24 hours after those orders came out and obtained immediate relief in both cases.
A.G. Weiser, can I ask you to talk a little bit about the question that I asked, but also what concerns you about this moment that you may not have anticipated?
I sued the Biden administration. I was in litigation with the Biden administration. And I'm in litigation with the Trump administration. What's different now that is alarming is the question asked by a district judge in Washington State, a Reagan appointee, who said, "Where are the lawyers?" This birthright citizenship case is the sort of case that you never would think would end up in litigation, because the 14th Amendment speaks very clearly to this issue. That district court judge in Washington said this was the most unconstitutional action he'd seen in 40 years on the bench. What's different now, and there was an op-ed in Sunday's New York Times, it doesn't appear that lawyers are even being asked, can we do this? I just heard someone sigh. That's exactly the right reaction. We are, John Adams put it, a government of laws, and Abigail Adams gave him flack about this before the convention and afterwards, his words, not of men. That means we live under the rule of law, not under the rule of whim. That is foundational to being in a democratic republic. The core principle that we as a nation need to establish now, we will remain a democratic republic under the rule of law, which means a president can't simply say, I'm going to rewrite the Constitution, or I'm going to decide I want to do Congress's job and control the power of purse because I'll do a better job. That's not the way our system of government works. What's different now, and it feels even a little more different now than it did in the first Trump administration. Because first Trump administration, we had litigation and we overwhelmingly won. But I don't think there was a single case that was as stark as this birthright citizenship case, or even the funding case. And that's concerning.
John?
I, like my colleague in New Jersey, our priorities have not changed. What we do is we protect the rights of New Yorkers from incursions. The incursions have changed, the threat has changed, and it's drastic. One thing that's changed is I haven't gotten very much sleep since January 20th. The things that concern me the most in what we are facing is the systematic dismantling of the federal government and the incursion into all of our personal data that has been given over to Elon Musk, the treatment of vulnerable populations, immigrants, the federalization of the National Guard, the attack on transgender people, and the doxing of DEI program employees. We really are in unprecedented times. But we were ready, and we are fighting, and we are united. So it's the best place to work right now.
So, you know, among the many things that I have done while in the federal government is to pursue aggressive civil rights enforcement, environmental justice, programs that actually increase opportunity for historically marginalized populations, all of which are currently under attack. So I understand, and I've only ever worked for the federal government. I haven't had the privilege of working for a state AG. I mean, you never know. But I guess your priorities don't change, and yet the amount of work that falls on your plate when the federal government steps back from civil rights enforcement, not just steps back, but actually aggressively pursues an agenda to undermine longstanding civil rights precedent and the like. How is it truly that you are able, and are you able, and be honest with us, to pick up the kind of need that happens and befalls your community when the federal government really basically abdicates what is actually a congressionally mandated responsibility to enforce these laws?
It's hard. I will say I've been fortunate. I was elected at the same time that our legislature ended up having Democrats in control of both branches. So when I went to the legislature and said, I want to get the same authority the federal government has to investigate civil rights violations where there's a systematic denial of civil rights, the pattern and practice authority, I was granted that authority under state law. And that means when there's a pattern of policing in Aurora, Colorado that violates citizen civil rights, we were able to work on a report and then ultimately a consent decree so the Department of Justice didn't have to come in. And I believe we're better off with having a Colorado solution, having that authority, than had we had the U.S. Department of Justice, with all respect to the DOJ. I will say law enforcement in our state strongly supports this pattern and practice authority because there's no one who's more frustrated with degraded and, in some cases, wrongful policing than good cops who care about the integrity of the profession. I would love to have a partner in Washington, a partner like Vanita, who I'll say was the best person I worked with in the Biden administration. She, as what Matt said, she's extraordinary. You here at NYU should take full advantage of her and her wealth of knowledge, experience, and perspective. We are so challenged because we are getting it from multiple fronts. So if you just go down the list, if the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is not handling cases involving training repayment agreement provisions, or TRAPs, which is when people are signed up for a profession, then given some bogus training that they have $200,000 of debt that gets forgiven after working for 3 years, but if they leave early, if they pay it all back with interest. If the CFPB is not enforcing that, we have to do that by ourselves. If there's no federal Clean Water Act enforcement, we have to, and we are in Colorado, building our own state Clean Water Act. And if there's no federal civil rights enforcement, we have to do it. So to answer your question, it's really, really hard. And I am grateful wherever I can find federal partnership, and we've had it in the first Trump administration on antitrust, robocalls. I will always look to collaborate with the federal government wherever we can, and where they abdicate their leadership in an area, then we are on our own.
Yeah, I'm not concerned about our ability to address the consumer complaints that come in. I'm not concerned about our ability to continue the good work that we've been doing across the state, monitoring police departments for systemic violations. I am worried that without principles coming from the federal government, that our institutions will abandon their obligations to New York citizens, and that will become overwhelming. That's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, look, we've all invested in our offices. I think this has been a long-term trend. You've seen states increase authority. I think you've seen state attorneys general's offices become better staffed. In 2017, well, Chris Christie was governor, so you can sort of read into that what you will. But we weren't exactly structured to be like an aggressive litigator and a litigating agency. We didn't have a Solicitor General's office. We now have a really strong Solicitor General's office. We didn't have an affirmative litigation section. We now have 150 affirmative litigators who are really experienced in federal court litigation. We didn't have an honors program. We now have 40 really talented star young attorneys in our honors program, so plug for that. But there are things that we can absolutely step up and need to step up. The fact that the Civil Rights Division is apparently no longer functioning at the Department of Justice, which I know pains you, it should pain all of us, because it's like, take this as somebody whose very own synagogue in Bloomfield, New Jersey, was the victim of a hate crime and arson 2 years ago, almost to the day. Who prosecuted that with me? The United States Attorney's Office and the Civil Rights Division in DOJ. So now we're telling people that if your house of worship is bombed, suddenly the federal government's out of that business. Not sure people fully appreciate that. Take 6,000 FBI agents off the streets, something that they're threatening to do. What do you think is going to happen? It's going to be harder to investigate drug trafficking, gun trafficking, complex crimes. People are going to be less safe. So states are absolutely going to have to step up, but we are seeing a scale based on what President Trump has done and what Elon Musk, who nobody elected and nobody authorized to do what he's doing, apparently is scaling down the federal government. I don't think this is what people wanted. I don't think people voted to say, if your house of worship is bombed, the federal government's not going to care. If you're in a city or a state where you're dealing with crime related to drug trafficking, suddenly the federal government's stepping back from that. And as much as we can do and will do, there's no question the federal government should and must play a role in these efforts, and them deciding not to is going to affect residents of this country.
Yeah, it's while I think, look, every president has his policy prerogatives and agenda, it's, I think, and you all prepare, groups were preparing in all of the ways that groups will. I think the actual attacks on federal government infrastructure by a person who was unelected, who doesn't frankly seem to know that much about what the federal government does, and what we're watching in real time with USAID or at the Justice Department and the threats to purge the FBI and the like, to me, are among the most pernicious things, because those are not aspects that state AGs can necessarily, and you should tell me, is there a role for state AGs on that set of questions separate from kind of enforcement and picking up or continuing to do the really important work that you all do? But it's this attack on federal infrastructure and on the federal workforce that actually is really undermining institutions already, where Americans have their faith in institutions is too low, that I am really concerned about, that feels uniquely different about today than in years past. So I just want to ask, do you see a role? Is there a role for state AGs around the kind of federal infrastructure, federal workforce, except, of course, to hire the people, the very good and dedicated public servants that serve in our federal government? Perhaps that's one role, but you all have limited staff. So I'm just curious about that question.
Well, a number of us, I think all three of our offices, sent a letter to the Senate Judiciary Committee and minority leadership about the FBI. And Matt referred to this. I'll give you a little bit more detail. 6,000 FBI agents doing their day jobs were assigned to investigate crimes committed on January 6, 2021. They were doing their jobs. Police officers were attacked. Federal government was vandalized. For doing their jobs, they're now potentially subject to being retaliated against, having their identities put out there so they could be harassed, and they're worried about losing their jobs. That is one story of the many you're referring to, Vanita, about federal employees being told in one shape or form, you're not wanted to do the work you've been doing. We don't value that work. And Jen also referred to this point. It's worth highlighting. It's easier to burn something down than to build it up. So if we undermine the ability of, and you can pick whatever agency you're thinking about here, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, if you just say, we're just going to degrade it completely because we don't think it matters, and then later we're like, oh, actually, it did kind of matter that we were addressing hate crimes or drug trafficking, it's going to be a lot harder to build it back up. So one of the challenges is, how much do we hold that ground to defend institutions? How much can we? What tools do we have? And then how much rebuilding work will there be on the other side? What's really unfortunate is you could have a lot of conversations about how can we make government work better. Jen Paulka, whose book I would strongly recommend on this topic, is someone who's worth following. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing a wholesale degrading of basic functions. We're not seeing a careful and thoughtful reevaluation of how do we better serve the people of the United States of America.
And just to add editorial, I'm going out of my moderator role for a second, but on the FBI, kind of the retribution angle on that, and the impact, as A.G. Plotkin said, on public safety, national security, because the FBI, all those agents that are on the list didn't just do their work on January 6th. They've been working every day on many, many cases, child exploitation cases, intel gathering, et cetera. And so, it is what I worry about with retribution. I want to hear about this. There's been a lot of talk about impoundment, and some of you, I don't know how many of you ever thought of impoundment before November 5th or January 20th. I'd love to have one of you really explain what the concerns are at the local level about if the federal government, holds congressionally appropriated funds that are supposed to go to your districts for any number of things, because you are not complying with the policy prerogatives of the federal government. Talk a little bit about impoundment and what that looks like on the local level, and whether you have concerns about the potential chilling effect or kind of broader concerns about what this rhetoric, at least for now it's rhetoric, although the OMB pauses a version of that, has on your constituents and the people that you serve in your state.
I'll start just by saying that what impoundment is, or what it looks like, or one version of what it looks like, are the executive orders that the president already issued, which say, most of them say something along the lines of, examine all spending by the federal government that does anything to promote wokeness or DEI or the environment or turbines, and look at how you can cut off that funding and otherwise undermine those programs. One of the first actions we brought, it was the second action we brought, was an action that got a court to stay any cessations of funding pursuant to those directives. And we're moving for a preliminary injunction on Friday in that case. Nonetheless, the federal government had already sent notices out to all of our state agencies and all state grantees saying, funding is over for all of these programs, temporarily stop everything. And even though that weekend, DOJ sent a memo to all the same people saying that those actions were stayed, it still has the effect. Hospitals in New York are canceling appointments for transgender care. They know that the funding threat is not in existence right now, but they're looking down the lane. They're saying, but what if it is in a year? We can't risk that liability. So the chilling effect is real. There are legal arguments, but it's hard to climb back.
Yeah. First of all, one of the reasons why Jen hasn't gotten any sleep is because she's been working around the clock on that case, and she and staff across the country deserve tremendous amount of credit for how hard they've worked, multiple all-nighters in the first 2 weeks. So thank you for that, Jen. Look, there's a legal fight here. What the president in the OMB order didn't cite to a single body of law supporting what he did. They're not even trying to use the legal authority under the potential for a president to impound funds. They're not even pretending. So there's a legal fight that we're going to have. But there's also, people need to wake up and understand how extreme this is. Look, there's not a single one of us who said on November 6th that President Trump wasn't duly elected. Big difference from November 2020, by the way. But presidents have broad powers, but they are not kings. They cannot rewrite a constitution or overwrite laws. And so if he wants to have a debate about any of the issues Jen raised at a policy level, God bless. He's entitled to put forth legislation or work with Congress or use his administrative tools to try to do that, and I might disagree with them. What he cannot do is do what he did last week, where he told millions of people who depend on critical services that were legally authorized that they weren't going to get them because he can't win that policy argument through the legal avenues, which is the reality. Or he hasn't even tried to win that policy argument or political debate through the appropriate channels. And I think people need to appreciate, like, these are not just words on a paper. When he says, I want to end the Department of Education and Title I funding, I say this as a parent of 2 young kids, if you have a kid with autism, it means they're not getting services. When they end Medicaid, It means, like I said, your parent in a nursing home is getting thrown on the street. When he ends low-income heating assistance in a brutally cold winter, like it's been, unfortunately, here, and probably in Colorado too, I'm guessing, it means they're not getting heat. That's the level of pressure they want to put on folks. And they want to talk about the policy differences they have between blue states and red states. There's a way to do that. That is not new. What is new is leveraging the full power of federal funding, violating the law, and saying, we will literally cripple you, we will kill people, we will starve people, we will deprive them of life-preserving services if you don't agree with me on some unrelated political issue that I haven't even tried to win through the legal channels.
So one quick counter from the first Trump administration to the second. The first, the closest we had to this was an effort that would take money that was appropriated for the defense budget to support military installations and use it instead to build a wall along the Mexican-U.S. border. And our position in that case was that violates separation of powers. The president can't rewrite the budget. It went on. We ultimately were successful, but it also became moot when Biden became president. The case now that we're talking about, there's two critical principles. The first is post-Watergate, because Nixon had tried this on a small scale, there was a law that Congress passed that prevents the president from using the impoundment authority. The president may argue that law is unconstitutional, and the executive branch has this inherent authority to impound funds. The hard part about that is you're pushing power away from Congress to the executive branch, and we've already been in a time where the executive branch has had more and more power, and Congress is more and more unable to function. Congress still passes budgets. That's the one thing they still are doing. And in the budget, routinely, they're mandatory programs, like you invest money in like this HIDA program, drug trafficking. That's a congressional decision. That's different than saying the executive branch can decide in this pot of money how to spend it to improve education. And if you basically took every mandatory spending program and turned it into a discretionary one, that's a massive reallocation of power from the legislative branch to the executive branch. And one of the challenges that this moment is going to reveal is, will separation of powers or will checks and balances hold? Or instead, will we see agglomeration of power to an executive branch that will be very much outside of what the founders could ever have envisioned, and I think would be harmful in some of the ways that Matt was talking about.
So let me do a devil's advocate question, or it's actually, it's an important question, which is the federal government has plenary power over immigration. And so one could argue. Don't tell that to me during the prior administration. And so one could argue that this immigration policy gets set by the federal government, and there's little role to play, minus Texas, as Matt said, for states, and that states need to get out of the way and follow the federal government on this, and as long as, there's due process, et cetera. How do you, given how charged immigration is, both it was part of the way that got the president elected, but it's also something I know your states, have a lot of immigrants, each of them. How do you view this relationship with the federal government on issues of immigration and some of the mass deportation talk that's been happening in preparation?
Well, we're going to see, is there threatened mass and almost by definition indiscriminate deportations? If they happen, and your caveat here was pretty important, in a way that violates due process of law, then we're going to be in litigation on that issue. The president has to follow due process of law. What is painful is the normal immigration processes have generated a backlog of close to 1 million people who are eligible for deportation. So in a more normal environment, there would be an effort to deport those who've gone through the whole legal process. These mass roundups that have been threatened would go around that normal process and would find people, I'm not quite sure how, by where they lived, by how they looked, and would start saying, we think you're not here with the proper authorization, we're going to deport you. And perhaps before we can undo the damage, citizens get deported, Dreamers get deported. People married to citizens going through a process to become citizens get deported. That's not how we do things in the United States of America. We respect due process of law. And part of my point about the birthright citizenship is the way our government should work, and says something about how important lawyers are in the rule of law, is are we doing this the right way? Are we following the rules? Are we treating people fairly? And if the answer to that ever is no, the federal government shouldn't be doing it. And if they do it, we're going to stand up for due process, for fair treatment and legal treatment of immigrants and everybody else.
It's true that the federal government can set immigration policy, but there is also a longstanding principle that they can't commandeer state resources for the use of federal immigration enforcement. And that's where we see the tension here. That means that we can tell our state agencies that they don't have to let an ICE agent onto their premises without a judicial warrant. There was a memo leaked from DOJ that has within it a paragraph that says that all immigration enforcement officials at DOJ are ordered to look at the actions of local electeds or local government officials to see if they are standing in the way of immigration enforcement and to consider prosecuting them under federal law. So that's where we are. We're not in a situation where the federal government is setting a policy and the states are standing in the way of the effective enforcement of that policy. We're in a place where they are threatening local elected officials for following their own state law.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, I think we have to acknowledge that Americans are concerned about their public safety right now. I say this as the chief law enforcement officer of my state. It's a top, when I said priorities haven't changed, that is a top concern. And what we're seeing is even as crime rates have come down considerably, people don't feel safe. And I think we have to acknowledge that. Like, that is a real problem in our society right now. And if we pretend it doesn't exist, we are not responding to the concerns of our residents. And one of the ways that that has manifested itself, as we saw, is a very, very deep concern, including in states that didn't used to feel this, like New Jersey and neighboring states where this is a source of litigation, though we're 9-0 against New York in the Supreme Court. Ellis Island, is at least large part in New Jersey.
You heard it here, folks.
Sorry, Jen. We are a proud immigrant state. We have millions of immigrants. It's the story of my family, it's the story of my wife's family, it's the story of most families in New Jersey and most families, frankly, in America. But there's a couple things they're saying that are just flat out not true, okay? And we need to be upfront about this. There is no sanctuary anywhere in our state, and I don't think anywhere in the country. We do not have any policy that would say if you're a murderer, that we are going to protect you. We worked with the first Trump administration on that. We worked with the Biden administration. We will work with the current Trump administration. And I don't think we should be afraid to say that because they are labeling whole classes, millions and millions of people as murderers and people who commit sexual assault or other violent crimes when those people are not being given sanctuary anywhere. It's just a lie. The policy that, at least in New Jersey, that they're talking about was upheld in federal court multiple times, including in the Third Circuit on a panel that included an appointee of President Trump, 3-0. This is not radical stuff. What it's saying is that, to Jen's point, you can't commandeer the entire law enforcement apparatus of New Jersey to conduct civil enforcement, the same way you can't do it for any other civil enforcement matter, because we need those 42,000 cops I told you that ultimately report to me doing things that keep people safe. So yes, if there's a murderer or somebody who committed a violent crime, get them. But you're telling me you want them breaking into people's houses, or now, and this should really alarm people because they upended a policy that had been around for decades that was supported by bipartisan administrations, including first President Trump administration, that said we weren't going to conduct immigration enforcement at schools and hospitals and houses of worship. And why might that be a good idea? Because I have a 6-year-old. I don't send him with an ID. In a time when we have a youth mental health crisis, we want armed guards busting into schools, yanking a kid out of class, throwing him in a van, and having every other kid wonder what the heck just happened? That's what he's threatening to do. My kid had a school shooting drill yesterday, which is another thing I'm sad to say he's growing up in. And you know what the reaction was in my town? ICE came to his school. That's the level of fear that has been created. That's not a way to increase confidence in public safety. It's a way to increase people's fear about their own safety. And so we got to make sure we're honest about what people's fears are and what the legal mechanisms he has to address them, because those are two very different things right now.
So folks should get ready with questions, but I want to ask about where there's still scope for bipartisan work that you do with AGs. And I remember AG Weiser had this initiative among state AGs that I traveled out to Colorado for, very excited, called the Ginsburg-Scalia, was it Scalia-Ginsburg initiative?
Depends on who you are.
Okay. Everything is loaded. But it was an initiative that brought R&D state AGs together for a few days to have, and outside speakers, of which I was one of them, to have conversations, and I'm sure to build relationships and to think about issues where there's space for common ground. I was there to talk about policing and law enforcement work that I've done with really incredible police chiefs around the country, and we talked about that. And then I didn't see that initiative so much. And I don't want to read into what happened to the initiative. I want to actually get concrete right now. You've mentioned, Phil, about antitrust, and some of you have mentioned consumer protection, but where do you see scope? Where are you having conversations kind of across the Democrat-Republican divide among state AGs for work that you want to do? And what do you make of the kind of climate for collaboration and coalition at this moment? And again, be candid.
The important point I'd make also about January 6th was that 47 state attorneys general wrote a letter afterwards that I led that condemned what happened and called for accountability, something that Attorney General Merrick Garland praised the National Association for Attorneys General for being able to do, to stand on that principle. Quite a different stance than threatening FBI agents for doing their jobs. The importance of state AG collaboration across party lines remains, and we are so far being able to handle something that is very important to me. We're working together in antitrust cases. So I'm, for example, suing RealPage, which is a software program that enables corporate landlords to set prices with private information. That's price fixing to me, just with a newfangled approach. And that is a bipartisan case. We are working together on opioids. Matt Platkin mentioned this work. It's been incredibly important. Every state AG's office in the country has been involved. In Colorado, we're bringing back $870 million from this, and I'm working on the state level in a bipartisan way to make sure that money's spent well. Every state AG's office in the country is investigating and/or suing Meta and TikTok for harms to youth mental health. So that work continues, and that collaboration continues, even when we're going to have different views on this action regarding birthright citizenship, for example. And it's really important that we can maintain collaboration wherever we can. And that will be my approach both to the federal government and with other state AGs. I believe we can have differences, and there are ways to resolve those differences, and it doesn't mean we can't work with one another.
Yeah, for the past 5 years, I personally have been working on the opioids settlements, which total over $50 billion, I think, at this point. And just last week, we announced a $7.4 billion agreement in principle with Purdue and the Sacklers. And it was me and my equivalent in Florida who led those negotiations. So over these past couple of months, post-election, pre-inauguration, he actually became acting AG in Florida. But we are both fully committed to trying to get funds to flow for abatement in our communities, because it's the same for all of us. Ideally, we would have a partner in the federal government, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. That's the way it should be, because it's about good government.
Yeah, I mean, I think I came into this job having previously served in a governor's office for several years, and I was unsure really how much bipartisan work actually happened. And I was frankly positively stunned by how much engagement we have across our offices. And I think that needs to continue. By the way, it's also true with the federal government. I led the Apple DOJ state for Apple, the antitrust case filed by the Department of Justice in now I think 28 states, which included Republican attorneys general and Democratic attorneys general, because it's about ensuring that Apple can engage in unlawful practices that result in you all paying 4 times more for your iPhone than you should pay for. And I think that's the type of core work that needs to continue. And I hope there are things we can continue to do with the federal administration. There's work that we do that is really important and it matters in people's lives. And it goes to what I was saying before. My priorities are very clear, especially being non-elected. Like, how can we do things that protect our residents? And that's been true if we're suing big companies with other Republican AGs. It's been true with different federal administrations. I've taken on issues in my own party in New Jersey, which haven't always been popular. But like, if we stay consistent on that point and we try to work together where we can, I do think we can make a difference. And the other thing I would point out, even if you have a Republican attorney general, it doesn't mean 100% of the people in that state voted a certain way. It doesn't mean even if they did, they shouldn't get relief from the opioid epidemic, or they should have to pay more for consumer goods or for rent. So I think at some point we got to understand where the politics end and where the work that really matters for our residents exists. And we have worked really hard, and I'm proud. We're probably one of the last collection of public officials that continue to work in a meaningfully bipartisan way.
So that's great to hear, truly. And if I could have folks that are interested in asking questions start to make their way up to the mic, while we do that, I thought I would acknowledge a former Attorney General who is in this room, the former Attorney General of Maryland, Brian Frosh. Good to see you. Thank you for being here today. You're going to have to remind me. I remember working with you both when I was in the Obama administration and then when I was heading up a civil rights organization, but what were the years that you were Attorney General? And do you mind coming up to the mic and just sharing maybe 2 to 3 minutes of your perspectives of having been a state AG in turbulent times, I'll put it that way.
Thank you very much, Vanita, for the kind words. And I think I have to say at the beginning that, like Matt, I was not lucky enough to go to NYU. But the one thing that I remember from law school on those select occasions that I went to class was that I tried assiduously to avoid getting called on.
Oh. I pulled a power play that said called on you. Apologies.
That's okay. First, I want to say congratulations to NYU for this outstanding panel, from the moderator to all of the other panelists. I was the Attorney General of Maryland from 2015 to 2023, so I got the full Trump term, the full first term. And it was not the job that I had run for at all. I had hoped, as I think Matt and Phil have expressed, to be the people's lawyer, to be doing good things for the people of Maryland. And, you have to represent the state and the governor and the executive agencies. But the reason that I think most people run for Attorney General is to do good things. And we were, to put it mildly, on the defense for 4 years. And our office filed or joined in, I think, about 95 lawsuits. And the thing that I think is remarkable looking back is that we won almost all of them. We lost a few here and there, but the state AGs had a tremendous record of defending our people against the various predations of the Trump administration. And I think you've seen right here, all 3 of these folks have talked about what's gone on in 2 weeks. Attorney General Platkin failed to mention that he was the one who led the lawsuit against Trump's attempt to overturn birthright citizenship by executive order, and they filed suit the day after the executive order. I thought that was astonishing, and brought a lot of other attorneys general with him. In addition to that, they got a decision, I think, a day later. So that was extraordinary work. The bad news, I think, is that the Trump administration has been planning for quite some time to overwhelm the system, to undo democracy in the form that most of us know and appreciate. But the good news is they've had this blueprint out there, and it's apparent that the attorneys general are reading the blueprint and prepared for the actions that are coming. So I want to say congratulations. These are three of the best offices. There are many, many great folks around the country, but these are three offices that have had an extraordinary effect, and I expect them to continue that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great. If you can come to the mic, and if you're a student here, if you can just tell us what year, I don't know, it'll help folks situate you. Thank
Sure.
you.
Thank you all so much for being here. My name's Kahari Kenyatta. I'm a second year and proud to have grown up in Bergen County, New Jersey, I'll mention. So picking up on the last remarks, obviously this administration has the intent to really challenge our system of laws. And on this panel, you've discussed ways in which, whether it's encroaching or diminishing the role of the legislature through impoundment or challenging constitutional values. And what comes to mind today is the recently fired NLRB director challenging her dismissal, which brings up the question of Humphrey's executor. Strategically in your offices, how do you balance the need, the necessity, the mandate to defend your citizens, your residents, against the inherent risks in putting up these large, weighty questions of constitutional law, which have the potential to go up to a court which has seemed to give little heft to longstanding precedent?
Well, we're going to learn a lot about the Supreme Court in the years ahead, and I am probably on the more optimistic side compared to many. I think this impoundment case and I think this birthright citizenship case are both going to rule against President Trump at the Supreme Court. Now, that's not to say he's not going to win some close cases. It's not to say that I will defend cases like the Dobbs decision, but you do have some actions happening now that are so lacking in legal authority that I don't think the Supreme Court's going to have a hard time with them. At the margins, you raise a good question about strategically, do we think hard about what circuit a case is in or what risks we'll get of a bad decision? Yes, we have to. And in some of these situations, we're going to need to think hard about how we play our cards. But I think ultimately, when things are so beyond the pale, we're not going to be able to let them stand, and we're going to operate on the assumption the Supreme Court is going to do what, again, I think any reasonable Supreme Court would do in this case, the birthright citizenship case or impoundment case, and uphold the law.
Yeah, I would, first of all, what town? Ah, there you go. We'll take you back anytime. Look, very quickly, I think we all look at each case through the same lens, which is it violating the law? Is it hurting our residents? Can we do something about it? And like those two cases are great examples. Clear violation of the law, clearly hurting our residents. Okay, so we sued. And my job is to do that every time. And does that mean we will win every case? I hope so. As Attorney General Frosch said, we won over 80% of the cases, which by the way was like the inverse of what usually happens. Usually it's historically win about 20% of the cases. It's because they violated the law so clearly so many times. And even this Supreme Court, I don't think is going to read the 14th Amendment and say it doesn't include birthright citizenship, because it's just so laughably wrong. And so, but we will be, sorry? Yeah. So we will continue to bring cases when those questions are answered in the way as I suggested.
These two answered the question perfectly, so I'm not going to say something responsive. I'm going to instead say that we are really, the cases that we are going to end up litigating are going to be the cases that are studied in law school in 10, 20 years, because it's completely unprecedented. The things that we are going to have to try to challenge in courts because there's nowhere else, it hasn't been done before. So it's a great time to work in an Attorney General's office.
And I would also, just to add a fine point to what you're saying, Jen, is I think part of the shock and awe and the kind of where are the lawyers, some of this obviously has not been run through the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department, is what looks like a tee-up, actually, to the court on some key questions of the scope of executive power. And that this may be an intentional strategy to find some of these big-ticket cases, two of which may end up going to the court in a time where there's a lot of discussion and already, jurisprudence around the scope of executive power. But this, as you said, I think this will be a moment that in generations from now, people will look and study what was happening with the scope of executive power from the summer decision on executive immunity to everything that will be playing itself out now. And that is going to be, we're going to be living it in real time, and you are going to be doing that work.
Let me pick something up, because Richard makes an important point. There is another argument in the birthright citizenship case. There's a clause that says under the jurisdiction thereof, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. My understanding of that is if you are here as a diplomat, you're not subject to U.S. jurisdiction. If you're here as a soldier in an invading army under the Geneva Convention, you're not subject to traditional U.S. jurisdiction. But anyone who's here, whatever their status is, they can be prosecuted in U.S. courts. They're under U.S. jurisdiction. That's my theory of the case. That may not win unanimously at the Supreme Court, but Richard, I'm happy to take the bet that we're going to win the case. This is what's great about being a law professor.
So many mistakes in the argument. Anyone who wants to debate this, I'm happy to do it. But essentially, there's a lot of comments, and that wretched decision that you saw in Washington State was a string citation with no argumentation.
What was a TRO?
So we can have a forum on this. Hold on.
Listen,
Phil.
the good news is, in the years ahead, there'll be lots of case studies for debate, because issues that we hadn't thought were on the table are going to get raised.
There you go. That
And this is
true.
an issue that we had thought had been settled. It will maybe get for the Supreme Court. I mean, part of what could happen is if you have multiple cases, if there's no circuit split, the Supreme Court may not take the case. But there's going to be a lot of room for debate. And if you can only take this from the standpoint of these are interesting issues and ignore the harm that's happening to people, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? It's certainly going to be interesting to study it. But I do think part of what makes this time so hard is how many people are hurting. And this is something that we all hear about. One thing I'll make another pitch for working in state AG's offices is we directly represent and in relationship with people and communities. And I didn't realize the Department of Justice, when you're at the federal level, you're more removed in a way that we as state enforcers aren't. We're very connected. We hear from people regularly, and it makes the work we do even more meaningful.
I might beg to differ on the characterization of the removal from, because we met with communities all the time, but that's a different conversation.
Vanita, you did.
So I want to make sure I get to the questions, and also these people need to tell you how to get jobs at their offices, which I forgot, which may be the reason why many of you are here. So I want to save a couple of minutes for that, but let me go to your question.
Hi, thank you all for speaking with us here today. My name is Heather Lopaire. I'm a first-year student. I want to thank you for speaking about the issue of New York City hospitals canceling appointments for young transgender people seeking life-saving, gender-affirming health care in response to these, in my opinion, unconstitutional executive orders. I was wondering if you could speak more about what your offices are doing to counsel hospitals and other institutions, specifically with regards to trans health care and threats to funding.
So we have been doing that busily ever since we got the executive order that said that funding had to be maintained, because we thought that the cancellation of appointments was solely because of the funding. But as I said previously, it seems like large institutions have a long-standing concern about their risk, given that this is a temporary stay order. So we followed those conversations up with a letter saying that they would be violating state law if they were discriminating against transgender individuals in the provision of health care.
A number of us, I think, made a statement about what you just said too. These actions are unconstitutional and harmful. And so I believe we will prevail. There's a lot of people hurting right now, and it is hard.
And I want to add one thing, which is you asked Vanita what AGs can do, even if there is not an available legal challenge. I'll say that standing up to these policies publicly and speaking out against them, we received just an avalanche of responses from the communities that were threatened just because there was somebody standing up for their rights.
Hello, my name is Jonathan. I'm actually a 3L here, and I grew up in Colorado, so it's great to see
We're
you.
only doing questions from people who live in the states where these.
Where in
UGs are.
Colorado?
Evergreen, Colorado. So I'm moved to hear about your guys' work to uphold the rule of law. The Trump campaign and administration has often used the tactic of just accusing institutional actors or institutions as being illegitimate or being captured for political reasons, and especially since some of you are elected, I'm just wondering how your offices kind of foresee handling maybe those accusations and how you can strengthen the public's belief in your legitimacy while these happen.
We'll take you back too, Jonathan, anytime. The point you raise is very important. I think a lot about it. How do we build trust in our institutions? What's great about the work we do as lawyers is it's out in the open. It's transparent, the public can see it. And that's critical, that what we're doing in terms of building facts for our cases and making arguments that, again, are out in the public, and as Matt noted, in many of these cases, people appointed by President Trump, or the case I mentioned in Washington by President Reagan, are ruling against the Trump administration. I do worry about the delegitimization of our institutions and the degrading of trust. The best answer I can have is to make sure that I am always showing up and I'm accessible, that our office is accessible, and that we do our work in just the way I said, transparently and with an effort to build public trust.
Yeah, look, we all know trust in institutions is an all-time low, and that is true across the board. For me, I feel very strongly that we need to be consistent. You know, when we talk about the rule of law, when we talk about combating corruption, we can't pick and choose. I've lost a lot of friends in New Jersey for some of the things that I've done that I felt were consistent with the principles that I outlined today, because you can't get it right some of the time. It's not okay when it's, I was publicly critical at times of the Biden administration. I litigated against the Biden administration. You know, I've taken on corruption in my party in New Jersey, and I think we need more of that. And I think people need to see that there are people like Phil Weiser, like Tish James, who have stood up consistently for the right thing, even when it's hard. Because right now, my view of where the public is that they think everyone's out for themselves. Which is why you end up with what we have today. And I told this story in New Jersey right after the election. I don't comment on the election. I'm not on politics, but I do a monthly meeting with a group of high school students at Trenton Central High School. It's actually to talk about gun violence, but I happen to have a meeting the Monday after the election. And these kids, without exception, 30, 16, and 17-year-old kids said to me that they felt every politician was working for themselves. And if we don't think that's a problem as a country, if we don't think that is contributing to why rule of law can be degraded and people seemingly don't care, then I think we've totally missed what our fundamental challenge is. And I think we need strong institutions, and more importantly than ever, we need strong state institutions, because it's very clear it's not going to be coming from the federal government.
So we have 2 minutes before students have to go to classes or before the forum's supposed to end. Can I get both of your questions, and then they're going to tell us how folks who are interested can get jobs, all in 30 seconds.
Hi, quick question. So I know you said in reference to the New York AG's letter that there would be laws that are being broken on the state level. I feel like there are going to be a lot of cases where like NYU or Columbia or Princeton are kowtowing to either institutions or the Trump administration on these issues where there are explicitly state laws that are implicated. Where do you see the enforcement mechanism of like actually waging lawsuits against these institutions if they are doing things like canceling student visas or canceling appointments for transgender care?
Great. And if you can just pass the mic and then we'll go.
Thank you. For those of us who want to put our energy into this in the near term, what do you think separates out a good intern in your office from a great one?
Wow, there you go. Okay, perfect question to end on. So if you want, if you can answer to the first question very quickly and then give some sense of how people can get invested or engage with your jobs, which I think is also hope-giving, because I want to end on a note of hope. Phil.
Federalism is going to be having a moment because states have their own sovereign authority, and a federal government that is seeking to do things like limiting transgender care that can or tell us how to run our diversity inclusion programs. Those are going to raise profound issues. We're going to stand our ground. We're going to stand on principle, and we're going to defend our state's rights to govern, in our case, people of Colorado as we choose. And so there are going to be disputes. My job is to defend Colorado law. We have protections in Colorado for gender-affirming care. We also don't want to be commandeered by the federal government. We're going to defend Colorado law and the people of Colorado. With respect to internships, we have them. I love NYU students. We have a fellowship program that I also strongly recommend. We've had prior NYU students do both internships and fellowships. If you want to come grab me afterwards, I'll give you information. To be a good intern, be enthusiastic. Be excited about the work you're going to do. It's catching, and we love having interns who are dedicated, who want to learn, who aren't afraid to ask questions. There's a lot of great responsibility, and as I said, the work is as meaningful and important as it has ever been.
We also have interns, and I'll say there are two policies that this AG instituted when she became AG. One was that we would not have unpaid interns, and then the other is that we would have a fellows program for people who were just graduating from law school. And everything Phil said is right about enthusiasm and asking questions and being curious, but we also have a baking competition with our interns.
Okay, now you have to outdo these two about how.
Regardless of, obviously, I want you to come work with us, and you should come talk to me after. We have an internship program. Jordan's here, can help collect your information. Wherever you go, I want to underscore something that Phil said early. Going to a place that's not New York, DC, San Francisco, LA, or Chicago, as great as those places are, as a lawyer, you can have a massive impact. I started my career before law school in San Antonio, Texas, in local government. I was the only person from my graduating class who moved there. I went back to New Jersey. I was one of two people from my law school class who took the New Jersey bar. And both, by the way, are working in the governor's administration now, which is interesting. I say that because we really have a misallocation of legal talent in this country, and you can have a huge impact early in your career, regardless of where you go. And I think on top of that, going to an AG's office is the best place to go because it's big enough that when we do something big, I mean, you just heard the numbers that Jen mentioned on opioids. When we band together, we can literally change everything across the country. This is not to be critical of the federal government in any way where you can have great careers, but it's small enough that we can be nimble. I didn't have a reproductive rights team in June of 2022. 3 days after the Dobbs decision, I had a full strike force ready to go where we were bringing civil, criminal, and regulatory authorities under one roof. So come work, wherever you go, I encourage you to work in an AG's office. It is, I think, where the action is right now, regardless of who's in Washington. And come work with us and stay in touch. Last thing I'll close on with this, and Vanita knows this because she's very close with him. The reason why I'm here is because of me borderline harassing somebody who worked for Cory Booker at the time, who ended up becoming, years later, Merrick Garland's chief of staff. And he and I became very good friends and helped me build the relationships that ultimately led to this. And it was based on a cold email that I sent in law school wanting to be an intern. So I say that can really happen. The best advice I can say is don't be bashful. People want to help you more than you might think.
So I will just say, these are extraordinary leaders. I have been saying a lot, because I believe it to be true, that hope is a discipline, and you have to practice it every day, but you also have to get to work and take action. And these are folks in these offices are taking action every day. So I thank you for being here today. Thank you all for coming for this conversation. Really appreciate it.